Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the UW-Madison Division of Extension's Managing the Surplus, Reducing Milk Strategies webinar. This webinar will be focusing on strategies to reduce milk production with limited impacts on future production. My name is Ashley Olson. I am the agriculture educator in Vernon County, and I will be your moderator today. Our first speaker today is Dr. Victor Cabrera, and he is a professor and extension specialist in dairy management at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Dairy Science Department. Dr. Cabrera combines applied research, interdisciplinary approaches, and participatory methods to deliver practical, user-friendly, and scholarly decision support tools for dairy farm management. These scientific tools are aimed to improve dairy farm profitability, environmental stewardship, and long-term sustainability of the dairy farm industry. During his career, Dr. Cabrera has developed more than 40 decision support tools, published more than 70 referred articles, and 9 book chapters, presented in more than 100 scientific sessions, and given talks in more than 400 extension meetings in Wisconsin, other states, and several other countries. Dr. Cabrera has been distinguished with numerous awards throughout his career. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Cabrera as our first speaker today.
Thanks, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss some of the decision support tools we have available for dairy farmers, the dairy industry, consultants, and anyone else who would like to use data with the intention to improve the performance of dairy farms. We have started this work several years ago. I have 12 years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And throughout this time, my work and the work of my lab group, the students from master, PhD, and some undergrads as well, has been to put together information that has been requested by farmers, extension agents, and industry people to help dairy producers improve their performance in different management areas, like nutrition, replacement, health management, genetics, etc. So it is unfortunate, the situation we are living today and the crisis the dairy industry is facing. And so we want this time to use the same rigorous tools in order to help dairy farmers and dairy consultants cope with the new challenge that farmers are facing right now, which is reduce milk production. We need to do this in a very safe way. The idea is, and the hope is, this is gonna pass sometime soon, and then farmers need to be prepared to take advantage when this happens. So the changes that they do in order to improve or to cope with this situation shouldn't be in detriment for a long time in the dairy farm. This is the website address, and I hope many of you are aware of it, dairymgt.info. And if you are not, I really encourage and invite you to visit this website. As I mentioned, most of the tools that have been produced here have been a response to questions and inquiries that have come directly from the stakeholders, dairy farmers, dairy industry, dairy consultants. So there is the highlight and the core, the center core of the website are the decision support tools. And as you can see here, there are several management areas in which decision support tools have been created, like feeding and nutrition, heifers, reproduction areas, genomics, production, replacement, etc. And besides that, there is, in my opinion, good information about the latest research in management that can be found in the publication areas. There are some presentations, links, and other information that's relevant to the tools that have been developed. But the highlight and the core and the center of the website are the decision support tools. So as I said as well, um, today, unfortunately, because of the situation, we need to cope with the problem of additional supply that are not being, it's not been, farmers are not being able to sell at the moment. And we have developed in this work group within the dairy team who are organizing this webinar, a series of fact, sheet, fact sheets that deal with potential ways dairy farmers can decrease the supply of milk without hurting the long term of the profitability or performance of the farm. So there are specific fact sheets about potential calling opportunities. Um, I know this is a big decision farmers uh, may think very careful to do, but potentially we can do that if that's one option that the farmer would decide at the end. We should do in a very systematic way and using the best data we have available on the farm in order to uh, actually come back after the decision has been made and recover the dairy farm performance after certain short period of time. So we do have, for example, for that, and we're going to talk more in detail, a tool that will allow us to find out what are the best cows on the herd and the worst cows on the herd. So if there is a need to cull more aggressively some of the cows in order to reduce the milk production, uh, if that's, as I said before, the decision that needs to be made, then we should be able to find out which are the best candidate cows that should go instead of other cows. In my experience, and the data indicates that many times that decision is not being made very carefully on with all the data available. So we have a tool, and we're going to discuss in a moment, that can help us to do better decisions on that area. There is another fact sheet, and I really encourage you to actually get these fact sheets and read carefully these fact sheets. And another one deals with the early dry off. Another potential decision farmers could do in order to reduce partially the milk production is to increase the time cows spend as dry late in the lactation after the pregnancy. So here as well, the recommendation is to do this very carefully because we should not extend that dry off period too long, maybe from 50 to 70 days, for example. And if they do that, we need to know actually how much less milk we would be producing. And probably farmers, each specific farmer or farms will have the goal to reduce certain amount, certain proportion of the milk. And therefore, we have tools, and one of those that we're going to highlight today will tell us how much production we can decrease depending on the additional days that we can dry off the cows. And also will tell us, the tool, how much less income or income over feed costs we will be decreasing by doing so. Unfortunately, all these decisions will have a net return decrease. What we are trying to do here, what we should do, is try to have the least impact economically as we can. There is another fact sheet that's kind of deals with changing the frequency of milking. For example, from 3x to 2x. In the past, we created a tool that actually was intended for the opposite, to help farmers decide if they would like to increase from 2x, 2 times a day milking, to 3x, three times a day milking. And this tool, like a partial budgeting, will tell you how much is the economic value of doing that decision. Today, unfortunately, we need to use the tool in the opposite way, actually going back from 3x to 2x, and how much is the impact in milk amount and in economic value that we will decrease by doing so. So probably the decision at the end of decreasing certain goal of milk proportion in the herd would be a combination of the several decisions. And here are three examples of tools that are available for you to use and help in these difficult times. There are also there is another fact sheet about diet modifications. We do have a section about diet and feeding in the decision support tools that could help somehow on that, but not specifically on the recommendations that have been portrayed on that fact sheet. I will talk a little bit about that at the very end as well. So moving on, we have this tool that we call the economic value of a dairy cow. And in a nutshell, what it does basically gives you the relative value of every single cow in a herd, comparing all the cows at one point in time. So the user, basically what it's doing is comparing the future net return we expect from a cow and a potential replacement of that cow in the long term. And by comparison, we can actually find out the value of every single cow on the herd, and we can rank the animals from the worst to the best animal. In order to use this tool, the farmer or the user would need to define simple input variables in the tool, which are all portrayed here in yellow cells. And basically, the most important ones of these input variables are the cow variables. We need to define what is the situation of the cow at this point. If the cow is pregnant or not, is early lactation or late in lactation, so we can define that. And importantly, we can somehow portray the genetic value of the animal or the productivity of the animal, always in this case, in relative terms, compared with the other herd mates on the farm. After doing so, another important factor is what is the expected genetic improvement that will come with a potential replacement, whether the replacement comes tomorrow or whether the replacement comes 3 or 6 months from now, the decision becomes basically the same. The point is, we want to find out relatively which are the best animals and the worst animals on the herd. We need to define a number of herd variables, like for example, the production of the whole herd or the culling rate or the reproduction rate of the whole herd. These variables are important, but not nearly as important as the other variables because these will attain to all the cows and the potential replacement at any point in time. So it will influence the cow value, but not as much as the other variables. For example, in this case, for this third lactation cow, 8 months after calving, a non-pregnant cow, her value is $64, which is a low value, but positive still. If this value becomes negative, and it will become negative at some point, it would mean in normal situation that we should replace that animal because we will be getting more net return in the long term by having a new animal on the herd. But during these hard times, maybe sometimes we will consider culling animals even if they have positive value, but as long as this positive value is relatively low compared with the other animals. So basically what I'm saying is portrayed in this slide. We will have in these dots here in the curve, all the animals on the herd. And we can calculate this cow value or value of economic value of each single animal for all the animals on the herd. And we can rank them from the lowest to the highest. We will have some negative values and we will have some positive values, and we will have a very high positive values as well. In normal times, as was before, likely our best decision would be to replace those negative values. But in these times, maybe if we want to be more aggressive and the decision ends on having more aggressive replacement rate, we will need to start moving the arrow a little into the positive side, but those that have the lowest positive economic value. That way, this is a much more systematic way to do a difficult decision of calling more aggressively. I have no time to go into more details about that, but the point is with this tool, we can systematically and very rigorously have a value of every single animal on the herd, and that will help us greatly to do decisions of culling if that's needed. Next, moving on to the point of try to increase the dry off period of some animals. One key variable to do this decision is to actually portray and represent well the lactation curves on our specific herd. As you can see here, we have a tool that you can enter your own data, which are the red dots here, of production levels at different days postpartum here, for example. Let's imagine this is a second lactation data or data from cows in second lactation at different days postpartum. And then the blue line would be what the tool gives you back as a function of how that milk lactation curve looks like. That's a very important first step. And we can do this for each one of the lactations because this is gonna give us a good idea how much less milk or how much less milk we will be producing by increasing the dry off period. So in the same tool, in another tab, actually you can graph a smoother curve of what should be, in general terms, a lactation curve. Again, let's think this is a second lactation curve, and then we can actually graphically see what would be the change from 330 days to 350 days milk production decrease, which is blue marked in this figure. So let's assume that we have a cow pregnant at 120 days. The, the calving likely will occur at about 400 days if there is a 280 days of gestation period. And if we assume the change from 50 to 70 days of dry period, this will be the critical 20 days that will be producing less because we are drying off these cows early on. And that actually is being portrayed here in amount of milk that will be reducing our whole production on the herd. And we can this aggregate for all the cows that we will like to do a decision like this, right? Maybe we don't want to do this on all the cows. We want to select group of animals that would be more likely to have less detrimental effects later on doing so. But the other thing I want to show you about this tool is that in the next tab of the actual tool, we can be a little fine-tuned in our decision of drying off different times. Actually, here are two scenarios, on the left and on the right. On the left, we have 50 days of dry period, and on the right, we have 70 days of dry period. And actually, since we have already defined and portray well our lactation curve in a specific lactation, we can find out here, down here, what is the difference in milk lactation and income or feed cost that will change in each of these situations. For example, we portray this in the fact sheet that deals with this area of management, that for every 10 days of more dry period, we would expect on average, this needs to be done at a farm level, obviously, but on average, we would expect about 500 pounds less milk and about a loss of $60 of income or feed costs by doing so for every 10 days of additional dry period. This will change according to farms, and here is the tool that will allow them to actually bet make a better decision, which cows would be better off by doing so and decrease the goal of milk production that the farmers require. Here is another tool moving on to the other area of management that could help us to decrease the supply of milk. And here is, as I mentioned before, changing from 3 eggs, 3 milkings a day to 2 milkings a day. Literature points that this change, actually, as I mentioned as well, uh, between 7 and 8 pounds of milk would be the increase or decrease by doing this change. Originally, this tool was created to see the value of increasing from 2 to 3 eggs. But we can use in reverse order. Basically, the decision is exactly the same. The value is the same, only in the opposite direction. Like, for example, here, changing from 3 eggs to 2 eggs with the conditions that you see on the left that they should be farm specifically defined. When we have a cost of feed of 0.10 per pound of milk, we will be having a loss of net return of about $51 per cow per year. And actually, that will represent uh, about 1,000 pounds of milk of less production when we do so on a per cow basis. So therefore, also with this tool, it can help us to add to the goal of how much supply of milk we could decrease safely, temporarily on our farm uh, to actually handle and cope with these difficult times. We do have a section of feeding and nutrition with a number of good tools that could be also helpful in this decision. As I mentioned before, they don't relate exactly to the decisions that are portrayed in the fact sheet, but I just want to point you out to two tools that I think could be useful in these difficult times. Feedball, which actually allows producers and consultants as well to find out what are those feeds that have a better value per nutrient content. So basically it uses all the feed prices at one point in time in the market, and it will give you a list of the best feed purchases for the farm. That could be very helpful anytime, but even more at these difficult times. And the other one I want to point you out is the grouping strategies for feeding lactating dairy cattle. This tool deals with only lactating, producing milking cows. And the idea is actually to have diets more accurate to their needs. And uh, that could be achieved somehow by grouping or by feeding different groups of animals, different animals that have different requirements. I think this could be a very important decision of thinking on the farm at these difficult times that could help at least save some money on that situation. And I believe this is my last slide, and I just want to point you once more to the fact sheets that I believe are going to be released after this webinar, and I want to point you those out and encourage you to take a look to those that I think they have very good information for these difficult times.
Alrighty, thank you, Dr. Cabrera, for your presentation. I want to remind everyone that you can use the question and answer function to submit questions if you have them. And then we will do our best to answer them towards the end of the webinar after all our speakers have finished. And so moving on, I would like to introduce our next speaker is Richard Wallace, Doctor of Veterinary Medicine. He is a senior dairy cattle technical service veterinarian for Zoetis. Before joining Zoetis, specializing in dairy, Dr. Wallace was a faculty member at the University of Illinois as a dairy extension veterinarian and faculty coordinator and Dairy Farm Manager for the U of I's Dairy Cattle Research Unit. He is also a past president of the American Association of Bovine Practitioners and the American Association of Extension Veterinarians. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Wallace and his presentation. Thank you.
Seems like you're muted, Dick.
All right. How about now? Can you hear me?
We are good. We can hear you.
All right. Now we're going well. Yeah. So Dr. Cabrera did a very nice job covering some of the nice tools that the University of Wisconsin has for understanding how we can go about reducing our milk production in a logical fashion. I guess I want to go through a little bit of the what and the why, and maybe some of the why nots as we kind of walk through where we're headed with this current situation. First, a disclaimer is that we need to keep in mind that one size doesn't fit all in these decisions, and there's really no perfect answer here. All the strategies that Dr. Cabrera discussed and that I'll go through again today, we just need to consider that in the context of the current situation on your farm. We know there's differences that exist by the dairy system that you work in and the different farm management styles, as well as some of the opportunities you might have with different cooperatives where you might send your milk. And then certainly those processors have different situations, and understanding what the end product of that processor is important. We really recommend that you confer with your extended farm team, which should include your veterinarian, nutritionist, banker, milk hauler, and any other consultant that really has a good, strong understanding of your current farm situation. So just keeping that in mind, and just to let you know that Zoetis is here as a resource as well. We've got plenty of colleagues here across the state of Wisconsin that are here to help if you should be able to need those or seek those out. So let's kind of jump right into it and just talk a little bit about why we're here today. As we know, the COVID-19 has really changed a lot of our lives. In the military, they use a term called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And if you think about the situation we're in, pretty much have been in since maybe the last 2 months, March and April here of 2020. It's definitely been a volatile situation, particularly when you look at milk prices and some of the things happening within the dairy industry. That's leading to a lot of uncertainty. There's certainly complexity in how the COVID-19 is being handled from a government and a stay at home and go back to work, and the complexities of understanding diseases and epidemiology and how diseases spread is certainly part of it. And then there's some of the ambiguity around, when is this going to get back to normal? So understanding that this is a VUCA situation, and the military uses this term for other situations that they obviously run into. So I think it's a very fitting term. In addition to the human toll between disease and then unfortunately some of the mortality that we've seen with COVID-19, there have been massive disruptions to the supply chains and the distribution systems across all industries, let alone the dairy industry. And that's really what's created a lot of the price volatility, in the world markets in general. We've seen in the US, there's been a dramatic shift from the normal 50-50 food services, retail utilization of food products to more of a heavier reliance on retail disappearance. And it's unlikely that this shift to retail will offset the food service losses. So if you think about the restaurants, the schools, a lot of those food service industries are, were scaled back dramatically. Obviously, the schools were school lunch programs, but even restaurants, while some are still providing carry-out service, most of those restaurants are no longer providing the food output that we normally would see. And that has an impact on the ability of those products that are intended for food services to get out in the real world. And then I think we've got the other concern we need to think about is every spring, the dairy industry in the United States goes through what we'll call the spring flush. It has moderated over time, but we still continue to see an increase in milk production every spring as calving start to increase from increases and improvements in conception rates in the fall. So it looked like this year was going to be another very strong year for a spring flush. And so one way or another, that spring flush has been impacted. And that adds an additional layer of doubt and ambiguity to the whole process of trying to reduce milk production in the face of a time when our dairy herds are really expanding in production and expanding in fresh cows. The dairy industry was hit pretty rapidly, and understanding, those of you obviously are all involved in the dairy industry and understand the extreme perishability that we have of dairy products, and you just can't stop producing milk on a dime. You can't hold milk on the farm for a longer period of time. So if you think about stock industries where, you know, we can keep some pigs in a barn a little bit longer, or we can feed cattle a little lower energy diet and stretch their growth rate out. Or even in the agriculture or the vegetable world, you know, keeping some plants, you know, in the field a little bit longer. The problem runs with the dairy is that, you know, this product is very perishable, and actually we're seeing some of those ramifications now hitting the poultry industry as well as the vegetable industry. When you think about the losses or the demand destruction that occurred within the food service industry, it was nearly done and nearly complete by mid-March. We pretty much just slammed everything shut. And that food service demand, that, you know, $10 loss in food services was only offset by about a $3 increase in sales at the grocery stores. So while people were stay at home and were, you know, sheltering in place, we were seeing a decrease in the disappearance of food products, and particularly dairy products. That meteoric rise in the demand in the grocery stores was needed, but the unfortunate thing was most of our food processing plants and our dairy processing plants are not able to quickly retrofit and change from a food service retail packaged goods, you know, to the retail packaged goods from the food service side of things. So these facilities that focused on retail products couldn't increase their output fast enough to meet the demand, and we had the situation where grocery store shelves were empty and farms were dumping milk here in the state of Wisconsin. So that was a very frustrating situation. We know that export markets have you know, continued to provide some relief to the dairy industry, but the logistics of moving food products across the globe and because of the shutdowns and the biosecurity risks have increased some of the complexity of getting dairy products and dairy byproducts moved around. We know that the Mexico and the Chinese economies have been hit pretty hard, and I just have some recent data from the U.S. dairy export market shows that we're up the 7th straight month, even though we've had this pandemic occurring. But the volumes have held pretty well for exports. We're still in March at 15% for U.S. solids. So there are some advantages still to producing milk here in the United States. The biggest watch outs is actually Mexico. Mexico is our #1 destination for dairy products right now. And, you know, typically around 26% of our export goes to Mexico. So of that 15%, roughly 4% of that is going directly to Mexico. And last month we saw an 18% decline in the solids and the solids and the milk solids going to Mexico, which equates to about 6,000 metric ton losses of sales. And we know that the Mexican peso has been devalued and declined by about 20% compared to the US dollar since the 1st of January. So that makes US goods more expensive for Mexican buyers. And then you add to that this global oil you know, conflict that's occurring between the Russians and the Saudis. And we know that the Mexican government counts on roughly 40% of their you know, national revenues coming from producing oil. And it's very difficult for the Mexican government to then produce that on a mass scale at those prices. So there does appear to be a little bit of a strong indication that there's going to kind of a mess involved with continuing our exports to Mexico. We all know that the China deal for increasing their imports of our products in the trade deal that was signed recently, you know, so we have the question on whether China is going to be able to fulfill on that trade deal as well. So There is some concern there, but there's at least the signs are looking good so far, and we'll have to wait to see what the April data shows. We know that the processors have communicated to our Wisconsin producers and quite frankly, producers across the country, the need to reduce those milk flows in response to this COVID-19 pandemic. And many processors are forced to run at a lower level, lower volume utilization, just to ensure their employee health. That's also gravitated into our packing plants, which we'll discuss in a minute as well. The base plans were initially communicated, and some co-ops were asking for pretty significant reductions, some processors, and then others that didn't have as high of a patron percentage providing the raw milk to their plants, particularly some smaller cheese plants in Wisconsin haven't asked for any reduction at all. So it's been pretty variable, but certainly we're seeing this happen. And from a U.S. dairy industry standpoint, we expect to sell 8 to 13% less total product on a volume basis in 2020 as compared to 2019, just due to these initial months and the forecasts of going forward. Unfortunately, this was the sign that we saw, is that as those grocery store shelves were empty of fluid milk, we had farms that were having to find ways to get rid of milk that they'd already produced. And it was a very heartbreaking situation, but it is here, it is now. And I guess the question is how do we logically and effectively go on about reducing herd production? Dr. Cabrera talked about a lot of different ways that we can do that, but I think we need to really think about some of the goals. What's our ultimate goal in this whole process? First thing is we want to ensure that the health and safety of our families and our workforce are paramount. We need to make sure that reducing total production so that we don't incur any penalties. We had some processors that if you shipped more milk than what your base was allowing, they were actually causing a deduction and causing you to pay a penalty or a fine to discard of that milk. So we don't want to get to that point. We want to do this with healthy and highly efficient cows. That's an important part of this. So that it's never been more important to have good records and be able to maintain that information so that you can figure out who the healthiest and most efficient cows are, and using some of Victor's tools we can get there. We need to maintain our cow numbers as best we can so that when we get to the other side of this tunnel, we're positioned to reestablish our business operations and get our production back up. So we don't want to make decisions that are going to make very long-term effects as far as how that might impact total production and the ability to respond rapidly. So being flexible and nimble should the restrictions change. In fact, we've had a couple of our processors that initially requested up to 20% reduction in milk production, and then last week they said, well, we found out we've been able to move some product, and now we only need a 15% reduction. Well, quite frankly, those farms that already got to the 20% reduction are kind of kicking themselves now because they weren't able to respond and get their production back up. So it's still about trying to run cash flow through your farm, and for cash flow, you need to have milk flowing through the farm. So the big question we have is, how do you eat an elephant? And obviously we want to eat that elephant one bite at a time. And this is certainly a VUCA elephant for lack of a better term. So thinking strategically, as Victor mentioned, one of the first things we want to think about is going from 3X to 2X. So I want to talk a little bit about the why behind that and maybe the why nots and some of the things we can do. As Victor said, we know going on the 2X to 3X side of things, we can increase production. It's counter to many of our thought processes on finding ways to reduce production. But quite frankly, we do know that cows will reduce their production if you go back to 2X by up to 7 to 8 pounds, very similar to the gains that you would make. The difference would be at the type of cow that you might select to go to 2X to 3X. So many of our herds now are producing milk upwards of over 100 pounds of milk in some of those early lactation cows. And the reason why we went to 3X was to evacuate that gland more often to help reduce the pressure on the udder, keep cell count down, keep mastitis cases down. And so the ways that we're finding farms going from 3X to 2X is actually possibly doing some partial milking, where you might have the late lactation group that are more likely to respond actually better and reduce their milk production by greater than 7 to 8 pounds in late lactation. So reducing some of those cows that are under a certain pounds of milk or past a certain days in milk is certainly an option out there. The idea is we want to keep the parlor spinning, but we also need to find ways to get that 3x to 2x. So these are some data that Dr. Jeff Dahl and I did in a study while I was at Illinois, looking at the effects of frequent milking in early lactation. And the idea was actually to increase milk yield and improve udder health. And this study was really wrapped around milking cows in early lactation. Either from a 3x herd, you'd milk them 6 times a day, or in a 2x herd, you milk them 4 times a day in early lactation, just for the first 3 to 6 weeks of lactation, and finding ways to, from a physiology standpoint, improve milk production, much like you get a response to using bovine somatotropin. And what we found out, and we can use this information as we think about going from a 3x to 2x on a partial herd basis, is that the majority of the milk is produced. The rate of milk synthesis is highest in the first 2 hours after a milking, and it's really irregardless of whether you're milking twice a day or 3 times a day. And so with that strategy in mind, a lot of people still try to milk, say, a 2x part of their herd on a 12-hour interval. And that's really not necessary. You could probably milk a cow, anywhere from 8 hours and then, up to, even extending it, to 20. That'd be a longer interval than I'd want on a 2x, but, a 10 to 14 would be not a bad interval if you can milk certain pens to a 10 to 14 interval. And then that might force you to do some different things with your 3x pens, maybe your fresh pens, where you might be milking on a 6-hour interval and then a 10 and an 8 or something along those lines. So you don't necessarily have to milk them exactly on an 8-hour interval or a 12-hour interval. There are some ways that we can take a look at the physiology of the cow and the rate of milk synthesis and do some break points that are actually going to be fairly logical. You're not adding additional milk to the gland after a certain period of time, so you'll still do okay, but you don't have to milk them on a 12 and 12. So my point is, take a look at your herd. If you can figure out a schedule where you can milk a certain group of pens on a 2x, not the whole herd, but just some of those late lactation pens, pregnant pens, some of those kind of things, I think you'll have a little better options from doing that 3x to 2x and make it a little more practical for what you can do on your farm. Dr. Cabrera talked about drying cows off earlier. And so certainly checking those current days dry, and we really recommend that you don't extend those targets beyond 70 days. And there's some reasons for that. When you take a look at some data, this is actually 5 different dairies on 10,000 cows across 5 dairies right around the Madison area. And so what I did was I just summarized their data based on their current dry period length. Now, I realized that some of these cows, they weren't forced to have a dry period of 80, 90 to 100 days. And this is just, maybe through poor fertility or whatever the reason those cows end up having a longer dry period. But I think just looking at the impact of having a cow going from a 40 to 70 day dry period to a greater than 70 day, you more than double. So the relative risk of being sold or died in the first 60 days at the subsequent lactation is doubled when you go from a typical average 40 to 70 day lactation or dry period to that greater than 70. And when you go from that 40 to 70 to a greater than 90 day dry period, you triple your relative risk of being, so it's almost 3 times more likely that you're going to be sold or died in the first 60 days. So keep that in mind as you think about extending your dry periods. Now, you might notice over here that less than 40 days, they had a higher, almost a double sold and died. That most of that has to do with cows that don't have a full gestation length, so abort or calve early. And so you have to keep in mind, a lot of these early dry length cows weren't intentionally forced to have a short dry period. They had a short dry period because they had a short gestation length. But when you think about it moving over here, the main reason we think that this is occurring is because of overconditioning of dry cows. So if you want to extend your dry periods longer than 70 days, that's a possibility, but keep in mind that you need to keep these cows body conditioned. And I know Rick Grummer and some others, Randy Shaver, and some of the guys that have come through the UW system would provide us some really good data on overconditioning dry cows and how that is detrimental to not only milk production, but also health of the cows. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that not only is from a sold and died standpoint, those cows are also more likely to have some kind of disease, whether it's mastitis, metritis, ketosis, or DA. Cows that have longer dry periods tend to have more problems, a higher incidence of transition cow diseases, which then obviously leads to many of those cows leaving in the first 60 days as well because of those transition cow diseases. The other thing you have to keep in mind by shortening the dry period, it's really only a one-time event. So if you're trying to reduce production from 1 week to the next and you move a group of cows that you would have normally waited a week to dry off and move them into the next week, and you continue to dry cows off for a 70-day dry period, you don't change the number of cows that you're milking, because you can't continue to chop days or add days to the dry period week after week. And the problem we're running into is the spring flush. So we've got more cows calving than we're going to have cows going dry in the current situation. So the early dry off tends to be only a one-time decision to help you initially get some of that milk production down. The third thing we think about is feeding some of that milk to calves and feed it to calves for a little bit longer. Unfortunately, the disappearance is going to be somewhere only about 2 to 3% of the additional milk that you're producing if you're not feeding any milk right now. But we certainly can think about ways to feed these calves upwards of 3 gallons of milk per day for 3+ months. And we need to be concerned about what happens to the facilities then. Most of our calf hutches won't be able to hold a 90-day-old calf that's been getting 3 gallons of milk a day, because those calves are going to be huge. So a calf hutch won't be able to handle that. So we need to have ways to transition these calves into facilities that we can manage their welfare as well as manage that greater growth. Quite frankly, I think this is probably one of the biggest boons for the dairy industry, to understand really the value of feeding these calves a better nutrition in their early lifetime, because quite frankly, I think the calves coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic that got fed more milk are going to be really strong milk cows in a couple of years. But that being said, as we think about feeding additional milk, it's very important that we have a good record system monitoring calf diseases, particularly scours and pneumonia. I'd love to see us doing some more birth weights and calving weights and weaning weights and post-weaning weights, just so we can track the value of adding that added milk. So putting that information into your record system and maintaining that data is important, not only from the standpoint of getting the milk moved out, but also finding ways to utilize that information down the road as a way to better manage calves. Dr. Cabrera mentioned that you've got a great set of tools there for finding ways to manage the energy density of the ration. There's some concerns about that from a long-term basis. That's probably a little more of a longer-term impact, because as you change the energy density of the ration, it's going to be hard to ramp those cows back up, particularly if they're in early lactation. But certainly late lactation cows, we can add some bulk up to the diet. The big problem we have is the last couple of years, many of you in Wisconsin know we've had some pretty bad growing seasons. And so our forage inventories are really in poor shape at this point in time, and we may not be able to maintain that high forage diet or that more rough diet to decrease that milk production. I was on a call with a group out of Pennsylvania, and they commented on limit feeding. So I know that limit feeding is potentially an option, but you really need to consider stocking pen density, because I could certainly see some disasters in pens that have overstocked, and then you limit feed those pens to try and maintain a little bit tighter control on your feed inventory as far as from a cash flow standpoint, but also from a feed intake standpoint. And you got to make sure that all cows have an opportunity to eat, or then we're going to run into problems with lower dry matter intake, possibly some immune compromising situations, and then cows bleeding into some mastitis and others. The last one I want to talk about is feeding milk back to cows. And I noticed, Victor, you didn't have any comments on feeding milk back to cows. So let's just talk about this one a little bit. Certainly milk, the fatty acid and the protein profile is almost ideally suited Obviously, cows are making the milk, so it's ideally suited from an intake standpoint. But we certainly have some concerns about the logistics, bacterial growth, not only in the feed bunk, but also in the containers or the vessel that we're going to use to transport it from the milking center to the feeding center. And then as we get into summer weather, we got some concerns about heating feed. So logistically, I can see some problems with feeding milk back to cows. I can certainly see the rationale for doing it, and you definitely want to work with your nutritionist because of the fat level that's in that milk to make sure that you're not exceeding and what you're going to take out to replace that added milk. But I guess the other concern I have is what is the real true cost of feeding milk? So I put this together thinking about, oh gosh, you know, if I was actually buying ingredients, would I buy milk to feed my cows? And so what I've done is I've evaluated the feed cost of milk at the marginal milk production value. So let's make an assumption we've got about 11 cents a pound is the cost of the current dry matter in the ration. We're going to use the assumption that there's about 2.3 pounds of fat-corrected milk per pound of dry matter intake. Using a $15 100-weight milk price, we come up with about a 10 cents a pound of marginal milk cost of production. So this is the cost of the milk to produce it. Milk's only about 12% solids, where you got your fat, protein, lactose, and ash. So roughly the ingredient cost for that milk solids is about 83 cents a pound of dry matter. If you're feeding 10 pounds of milk a day at 12% dry matter, roughly that adds about $1 a day to the ration at 83 cents a pound of dry matter. And so we need to find a way to replace, that's only 1.2 pounds of dry matter that you're replacing at 83 cents for that pound. And so if you typically diets are feeding, around 55 pounds of dry matter at 11 cents a pound, so your total cost, normal feed cost today is about $6. So if $1 of that is now going to be part of this feed cost, and so it's about 16.5% of your total ration cost. To give you some perspective, when I think about sort of the ideal feed ingredient that I'd love to see in all the dairy rations that I have, is cottonseed is probably one of the key ones. It's got great fat, it's got good fiber, it's got great protein, and typical prices are around $3.50 a ton. But if you look at that on a cost per pound of dry matter, it's only 19 cents, about a fourth of what the cost it is for milk solids. Even if I was paying $500 a ton for cottonseed, it's only a third of the cost that it would be for putting milk in. And I don't know many people that would still be buying cottonseed at $500 a ton. So when you think about it from the standpoint of making milk just to feed it back to cows, I don't think that that's probably the best strategy. Certainly it's a way to get rid of surplus until you have a way to stop making that much milk, but I would not be spending my effort and time making milk at 10 cents a pound marginal milk value, and then coming back and feeding it back to cows. So, so far, all of these strategies we've done, and we haven't culled a single cow. And there are some concerns that we have, from a national beef strategy on flooding the market with culled dairy cows. And so I just pulled this up. This is the most recent slaughter stats that we have from April, end of April here in 2019 going forward. But if you take a look from 2020, you can see that, yes, the slaughter values are up a little bit by we get to the 15th, 16th, 17th week of the year compared to previous years. So the blue line is 2019, the red line is 2018 slaughter value. So typically this time of year, the number of cattle going to slaughter is decreasing. So we've maintained that number. So it's pretty much a flat line across from January all the way into the end of April. The majority of the reduction is actually occurring up in Region 3 and Region 5. Region 3 would be the Pennsylvania, so you think about the plant in Pennsylvania the cow plant that was shut down because of COVID-19. And then Region 5 is actually Wisconsin. So probably most of this Region 5 decrease in slaughter cows is, again, probably coming from our shutdowns of JBS and American Foods, or at least our slowdowns because of some of the COVID-19 issues that we're having up in the Green Bay area. Where most of the slaughter is barely picking up is probably in the Texas, Oklahoma area in Region 6. And you can see there's a significant increase in the head and the percent change from previous year, looking at from April 2019 to March of 2020. But that being said, there is some concerns among the National Cattlemen's Association that the dairy industry is going to be flooding the market. So we need to be sensitive to that, but we also need to understand logistics of keeping those cows around. So let's talk a little bit about some of those considerations of excess animals on our farm. So one of the things that many people asked about is, should I eliminate my overcrowding? Should I cull cows out so I'm not overcrowding? And quite frankly, if overcrowding currently is causing a problem with production on your farm, then you probably need to stop overcrowding, irregardless of whether this is COVID-19 or not. But that being said, most of the time when we decrease the overcrowding that's occurring in most pens, we actually see an increase in productivity because those cows that were not getting as much feed intake are allowed to get a little bit more feed intake. So you may not get as much milk production just by reducing overcrowding. Another area where we have excess animals is in our heifer inventory. And understanding that cash flow is always critical to management success, but it's more critical right now than anything. And when you're spending $1,800 to $2,000 a year to raise heifers, if you can move some of those heifers out of your cash flow, if so you're paying someone to raise those heifers at a heifer grower, you're no longer spending that money on raising heifers that you don't need. So really do a real, and I'm sure Victor has some great tools that we can look at heifer inventories and say, what kind of heifer inventory do I need? And we probably really need to look real close at the safety stock. Most of the producers I work with want to carry anywhere from a 10 to 15% excess in heifers. And we really need to look critically at carrying those excess heifers at this point in time until we get through this. Unfortunately, there's no place to go with those animals because, again, the meat packing plants and the beef system is pretty well bogged down by this as well. So that gets us to our list to build here for cows that need to go. And Victor showed you some great tools that you can use to rank cows. So there's a lot of different options here for ranking cows. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the thoughts if we take a look at some data coming out of, say, Dairy Comp, but certainly cows that are high risk. Those would be ones that it doesn't matter what their milk production is. If they've had mastitis 2 or 3 times, or they've been a lame issue 2 or 3 times, those chronic disease, those are 2 diseases that become chronic in cows. And if they've had a case, they're more likely to get another case. And so I would consider those high-risk cows. It doesn't matter what their milk production is. And quite frankly, if you have to get milk production down further, sometimes a higher producing high-risk cow that might get mastitis again is a better one to get rid of than, say, a cow that is giving medium amount of milk, but she's never given you trouble from a mastitis or a lameness standpoint. We certainly have some non-competitive first lactation cows and some non-competitive second lactation cows. And the line of thinking is to pull some of those younger cows out that are not competitive, but unfortunately that doesn't get rid of as much milk as, say, an older cow who makes more milk. So need, again, work through some of the numbers, use some of Victor's tools. If you have Dairy Comp, certainly make sure that you update the values in CalVal, because there are some economic assumptions in there if you're using CalVal as a decision tool. I like CalVal as a way to sort of determine what is that milk production level that is sort of the cut point for a profitable cow, or one to keep or one to cull. We can do some simple graphs. So this is just a scatter graph of looking at milk by lactation number by days in milk. And so you can draw a line, and let's say 60 pounds of milk is going to be our sort of a limit. And then you can draw a vertical line at 160 days in milk. And quite frankly, any cow that's under 160 days in milk should be produced, a Holstein cow anyway, this is a Holstein herd, should be able to produce at least 60 pounds of milk. And you can see most of these animals are first lactation. I might give some of these early lactation, first lactation animals a little bit of benefit of the doubt. Then we got this whole group of cows over here that are producing very low numbers that we need to really consider. So we can dive into this a little bit deeper, look at the same data based on reproductive status. And so the blue are the fresh cows, the sort of purple are going to be the bred cows, green are pregnant cows, And then the red dots are already ones that we've coded DNB. But what I do is I just take the open cows and the bred cows and the pregnant cows out, and I'm going to look at two groups. I got this population of cows that are fresh cows. So I might want to assess some of these fresh cows that are really underperforming. Do I even keep them in the herd? But then this also gives me the group of cows that I need to consider continue milking 3 times a day. I got these cows over 100 pounds of milk. There certainly is a group, or these cows that are in the ramp up phase of their lactation. I need to make sure that I'm going to keep them going in the right direction so that when we come out the other end of this tunnel, that will be prepared. But these cows in the red, we've already designated them as do not breed. And you've got some cows in here that are making a pretty good amount of milk. So if they aren't going to produce an offspring in the herd and you need to get some milk production down, those would be the cows I would move out of the lactating herd, at least for now. And then we need to decide when is the best time to sell them. And so that's the decision we need to make from when. A lot of that's going to be driven by market prices. And some of it might be also driven by your, your operating loan. If you have some of these cows that are on a balance sheet, we need to keep in mind that if your borrowing base is based on the cow, if she's still in the herd, even if she's not lactating, she's still in the herd based on the way your lender would look at the cow. And so, if you take some of those cows and you move them to market right now and you get $200 for them, but you have a $700 borrowing base, you're going to have to write a check for $500 to the banker just to keep your loan in order. So be very cautious and have some thought process around how you're going to move those DNBs out. There may be some opportunities to find a farm or barn where you could put those cows and put them on some kind of a feeding system, particularly if they have low body condition. We can convert that yellow fat to white fat and let the market settle a little bit, and then trickle them out when prices are right, because we'll continue to see that volatility in that beef market. But you got to really put a pencil and paper to that one. Let's keep in mind that only healthy cows make money. It's never been more important time than ever to make sure that we have healthy cows on our herd. We've done some work with Compeer Financial looking at the net farm income on dairies and what makes dairies financially successful over the last 30 years. And over that last 30 years, cows have averaged a return of about $250 per year on a balance adjusted basis. So when you figure that their net farm income return on a cow is about $250, and most diseases cost about $250 per incidence, except for maybe DAs, that means about half the cows are actually creating zero profit and the other half are creating about 500 to balance out to that average 250. So when you think about 50% of these cows receiving disease, that's kind of where we come up with our numbers. So preventing disease in the first place is really critical. And whether you're doing that with better genetic selection, or whether you're doing that with vaccines, or whether you're doing that with obviously just good management all the way around, it's really important, more important than ever, that we spend additional effort to making sure these cows stay healthy. Diseases tend to be a sunk cost. Sick cows make some milk, more milk than dead cows, but not a whole lot more. So sick cows aren't a good thing to have. And it's not a vindication on treating cows, because there is once you've already sunk that cost into raising the animal and keeping her there, it's important to keep her there. But it doesn't mean that you just need to stop and cull that cow, because we have to keep in mind that cull price right now is pretty low. So DNB in them is maybe an option, but finding a way to move them out. So with that, I want to kind of wrap it up. The goal is to take this one step at a time. This is not about winning the battle. It's really about staying in the game until we get to the other end of this tunnel and the light starts to shine. Don't try to figure out what to do for August or September or even 2021 right now. Stay focused on where we are right now. Get that milk production where you need to be, so you're not in a situation where you're having to be docked by your processor, but you also don't want to be dumping excessive amount of milk. So make sure you're making the right amount, because again, it takes inputs to create that output. The goal for today is to get through to today's challenges and move on to tomorrow morning. The goal for this week is to get through this week's challenges and move on to next week. So stay focused on controlling what you can control. There's things that we can't control. We can't control when the state's going to open up again. We can't control what's happening with the milk price. We can't control what's happening with the beef price. We can control what we have on our operations. And I think our next speaker is going to talk to us a little bit about how we can get that accomplished.
All right, thank you, Dr. Wallace. So we do have a few questions that have come in, and the first question is for Dr. Wallace. So what should producers do with cull cows if the market is lost or closed for a limited time?
Yeah, so I think that's where we need to, we've had a lot of farms go under in Wisconsin. Maybe a neighbor has an operation where there's at least water and shelter. Maybe we can work out a deal with them to move those cows to that operation and feed them for a period of time. While I was managing the University of Illinois dairy, I actually had a cull cow feed out lot. And so we never sold any cull cow for at least 30 days after we decided to stop milking her. I shouldn't say never. I mean, there were some heavy condition cows, but then my cattle buyer would show up at the farm and he'd go through the pen and he would pick the 8 to 10 cows that he wanted on the trailer that day because he felt he could get the best price for them. Now, granted, that's in a normal beef price market, but I would go from say 35 to 40 cents a cow for a thin cull cow to upwards of 75 to 80 cents a pound for a cow that's got really good body condition. And I'm not going to say looks like a beef cow, but she's put on some weight. And typically we fed, pretty much just the refusals from the dairy to those cull cows. Now, I would actually suggest you balance a ration for a cull cow and actually feed them and look at the rate of gain that you can create there based on what the markets are showing. But we really have to watch what's happening with that beef price because, selling them right now is pretty much a losing situation. And so again, I would feed them out for a little while and then try and trickle them out as that price starts to come back.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Cabrera, did you have anything to add to that or?
No, not for now, thanks.
Okay, the next question may be for either of you, Dr. Wallace or Dr. Cabrera. So which is a better decision, drying off cows early or changing the rations for less production? Realizing that changing the rations affects cow and you can't just flip a switch to turn the production back on when it's needed. However, if drying them off earlier is better, since there is science that shows if you increase their days dried, the next lactation will not be as productive as it could have been if the normal 45 to 60 days dry period was kept. So what are your thoughts on that? Drying them off early or changing the diets for less production?
You want to take this first, Victor?
Sure. So I mean, I would agree, and I have heard what Dick has mentioned, that to me, it would mean it will look safer to do. I will go with that without going beyond 70 days of dry off. That would be my hard limit of how much I will try to get the cows dry off. Changing the diet could have long-term consequences. And as it is stated in the question itself, it may take longer time to recover. Saying that, I would not discard the idea within the diet area of starting something that we have been proposing at UW-Madison for a long time to try, I mean, during these difficult times, maybe to increase the management area of nutrition accuracy to different groups of animals. If that's an opportunity, we do have cows in pens already. And many times we feed the same concentration diet to all the pens. There is an opportunity. If we have the time and the extra effort, we can actually split the cows in more closer homogeneous cows on those pens and maybe change a little bit the diets on those pens or dressing. Do a basic, what we call similar to a PMR, and then dress those according to the needs on those animals on those pens.
Yeah, I guess I just to echo what Victor said, I would do the same thing. I would start with drying cows off, not exceeding 70 days. That gets you some of your milk down, and then look at some of those late lactation pens and really, as I think I like the way Victor put it, precision ration, for those later lactation cows. Because the thing is, they're going to go dry and they'll have an opportunity to come back around. My big concern about drying cows off longer right now is that they're going to end up calving in July and August during the heat stress. That's the worst time that you would want to have a heavy overconditioned cow calving. So let's make sure that we're matching the nutrient needs of those cows, both in late lactation, but also during the dry period, and not extending that dry period past 70 days.
All right, thank you. I'm going to do one more question and then we will move on to our last speaker. And this again is for both of you. It says this presentation makes it sound like the milk surplus is only a result of the COVID-19, but in fact, we've had an oversupply for a long time. So why not think about how to reduce production for the long term? Thoughts on this?
You wanna give it a try first, Dick?
You throw that one to me. It gets back to actually one of my last statements is control the controllable. So yes, we've had it. Actually, the problem has actually probably been that we have more cows in the United States than we need. 9.4 million is about 200, maybe 300,000 more cows than we have for our domestic needs for dairy production, including our export market. So if we had about 9 to 9.1 million cows, we could handle the dairy product removal from our system, and milk prices would be a lot more stable. Long term, I mean, that's a political decision. Do we go into a quota system? Do we have some kind of and maybe there's a lot of things that are going to come out of this whole pandemic outbreak and what we need to do. It's going to be a difficult decision for farms to make once they are allowed to produce what they can, for them to voluntarily reduce production, because most farms understand that from a profitability standpoint, the more milk that they can create per cow, per stall, the more efficient they can be, the more profitable they can be. So profitability is still going to be the rule, but we need to find a way to manage that supply on the side of what the dairy industry in the United States can handle. So improving our export markets is going to be continued, and finding ways that the good thing is that the U.S. dairy industry is so much more prepared to respond in kind once this pandemic ends, to be able to bring milk back up and globally provide product to the global market. That's a little shorter term, but again, those are things that are kind of out of our control right now. So I would focus on what we can control.
I mean, I will make a short comment only. I fully agree with most or all the points that Dick just made. I mean, I like the idea that the dairy industry in the U.S. It's very resilient, and actually, I would think maybe an opportunity after all this hard time passes, maybe we should be able to actually have additional opportunities in the exporting markets, in the external markets. Saying that, the supply and demand issue has been a long time issue of the dairy industry, and maybe this is again an opportunity for dairy farmers to rethink and to think more. I mean, all these co-ops that now handle the milk started with in mind the farmers. Nowadays, they seem that the interests move away from the farmers, right? So every farmer looks from their own benefit, and I mean, it's very reasonable. I want to be more efficient, effective, and have the higher profitability. And in order to do so, I will push my boundaries of production. As long as I don't have a quota to limit my production, they will likely do that unless there is a regional or more longer term goal in which farmers would participate on.
Okay, thank you both. We do have a couple more questions, but to stay on track, I think we will move on to our final speaker, and then I can ask the other couple questions at the end. Dr. Wallace, can you give controls back to Tina so she
I
can,
did.
you did.
Tina does have control. Yep.
Start the next slides. And I'd like to introduce our final speaker today. And our final speaker today is Stephanie Plaster. She is the Extension Agriculture Educator for Washington and Ozaukee counties. She focuses on farm management, dairy and livestock programming across Sheboygan, Washington, and Ozaukee counties throughout a tri-county ag specialization. Through her extension work and experience managing volunteers and employees, Stephanie has had the opportunity to develop and hone effective communication skills and strategies and gain insight into managing discord and conflict in a positive and productive manner. She supports the agriculture community in helping others make connections through communication and active listening, most recently leading efforts in supporting farmers during challenging times. So with that, I would like to have Stephanie present on making the connection, the power of listening.
Great, thank you, Ashley. And just checking that you can hear me.
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Moving the slide forward here. Great. So I was asked today to talk about the power of listening and how truly listening can shift the whole mood of a conversation and make it a little bit more productive. So I'm going to briefly talk about some communication tips and tricks and why are we here, or more specifically, why am I here today on this Managing the Surplus webinar talking about this? And really, it's human nature to avoid conflict in stressful situations, that fear of the unknown. And it often seems a lot easier to avoid these conversations, which causes issues to fester. Because there's this inherent discomfort in these crucial conversations, especially when we're talking about stressful times and making hard decisions. And our jobs tend to focus more on the technical aspects and not the emotional aspects. And get ready, because I'm about to talk a lot about feelings, but it's okay. Because when we talk about communication, communication is really that successful conveying or sharing of ideas or feelings across when we're talking to each other. And there's really two parts to this. So there's us conveying what we're saying to our partner, and then there's listening and listening to what our partner is conveying back to us. There we go. So listening is this most fundamental component of communication. And really, the most basic and powerful way to connect to another person is to listen. Perhaps the most important thing we ever give each other is our attention. And that really holds true, because listening can really prevent conflict before it starts. If you listen to what your partner or what your person you're talking to is saying, they will be more ready to listen to you. And it's actually a key component of our relationship building and of our negotiating strategies. So this helps us not only when we're talking with our family, we're talking with our friends, our business partners, but also people like our lenders and our consultants as we go through some of these more challenging times. So listening requires focus. It's a concentrated effort, both mentally and physically. We need to pay attention to how things are told. That means listening for the language use, vocal tone, how someone is using their body to convey that to you. And it involves us being fully involved in the conversation. It does take a lot of effort, but it will pay off in the end, because it can really help us build that relationship and make more concrete decisions. So today I want to cover a couple of pieces. I'll talk about unconditional positive regard, empathy, active listening, the power of positivity, a little bit on autonomy, and then this concept of ask, give, ask. So the first piece I'm going to talk about is how we can actually make those connections and connect to each other. And I'll go over 3 core concepts here. The first piece is unconditional positive regard. And this is really the basic acceptance and support of a person, regardless of what they say or do. It is choosing to show genuine respect for the person as a human being and valuing them for doing their best to move forward constructively. You are removing judgment from the situation and really addressing the problem at hand. And I know this can be a really hard one, we're not agreeing with the person always, but we are accepting them. We're trying to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're doing the best that they can and trying to work with you in a positive manner. And this leads us into the concepts of empathy versus sympathy. And I think we hear a lot about empathy, especially during this challenging times. I know on the news, it's been all over the place. So really, let's start with sympathy. And that's that feeling of pity or sorrow at someone's misfortune. Sympathy is not a bad thing to feel. It's natural. But what we want to do is kind of elevate a little bit to empathy. And that's really being aware of the feelings, needs, and concerns of others. And this is a really core, important component of effective communication. Because what you're doing is you're feeling with someone and you're really trying to see it from their point of view and their perspective versus just feeling for them and kind of removing yourself from them. And the next concept is patience. And we hear this a lot too, but I like to remind myself that patience is the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. It's being able to control our reactions. So when we communicate with patients, we focus on the issue at hand and avoid personal attacks. We listen without reacting or interrupting because we're respecting others by listening to their point of view. And we're recognizing the feelings behind their words because they do have a motivation for what they're doing and saying. And we can more effectively communicate and get towards that positive outcome if we understand where they're coming from. So we're listening or we're responding with clarity and compassion, and we're really internally learning to tolerate that discomfort that frustration brings. And so one of the ways we do this is to take the time to respond and not react. So the basis for this is recognizing what you're feeling. You don't have to tell folks, but recognizing inside what you're feeling. And part of that is just to identify what it is so that you can control it. And so one of the great tools that I use to do this in order to take the time to respond, not react, is to breathe. And if you've never tried box breathing before, I really encourage it. And what box breathing is breathing in for 4 seconds, holding it for a count of 4, releasing your breath for a count of 4, holding again for a count of 4, and then repeating. And what that does is it allows you to remain calm, to keep a clear, open mind, and then to respond with positive body language and vocal tone, being assertive and not seeming aggressive in your response, especially if you're frustrated by the conversation. And that leads us into active listening skills. So skills that can help move this conversation forward and help you get what you want and what you need out of your conversations. So when we active listen, we use our ears. Really easy to remember and understand. And I don't have time today, unfortunately, to go through all of these deeply, but I will hit on a couple of them. So when we explore, we're asking for elaboration, and we're doing that through open-ended questions. Now, an open-ended question cannot be answered with a yes or a no. A yes or a no will just shut down the conversation. And what we really are doing when we're listening is we're trying to get more information. We're trying to get more information from them so that we can help come to a conclusion together. And so those open-ended questions really help us explore and curiously seek more information, especially if we're not totally sure of what's going on. And then affirmation is a great little tool. So it's providing some positive appreciation and encouragement. And so what you're doing is you're not blowing smoke, you're not overly praising someone, but you're just identifying the strength or effort that they're making in order to really bring that conversation back to a positive place to show that you're being respectful and that you are recognizing that even if you are in conflict, folks are making positive movement. And then reflecting, we'll talk a bit about this in a second, but reflecting is recognizing the feelings and the content of what is being shared with you. And then summarizing is recognizing the key discussion points out of all of the conversation you've had, recognizing 1 to 3 key points that have been said, and sharing them back with your partner to make sure that you're checking that these 3 things are the top issues that need to be resolved. So when we talk about reflecting, we're talking about reflective statements. And what that is is it's a tool you use to get at what's underneath what is being said to you and offer it back to your partner to encourage them to continue. You want to make sure to include facts and feelings, and this helps your partner, your conversational partner, know that you're trying to be curious, you're listening to understand them. And I got to be honest, this is really, really useful in a business setting, but it's way more useful for your family, for your partner, your spouse, or your children. These reflective listening tools can really help move you forward in your communications. And this may feel a little bit awkward at first, but some examples are you feel frustrated because XYZ. You feel an emotion that something else is happening. And the reason you want to use this tool is that you're putting it out there. You're making a guess as to what the person is saying to you and what they're feeling about it. And the reason you're doing that is because you're wanting to clarify that what you're hearing is what's actually going on. So if you're wrong, that's totally okay. That's the point. You want to make sure that both of you are on the same page. So make sure to throw out some of these reflective statements when you want to clarify the situation and make sure that the person you're communicating with knows that you're hearing and you're really trying to understand where they're coming from. And some of these roadblocks to ears, and I got to be honest, this rehearsing one is one I do all the time. Rehearsing in your head is not helpful. Interrupting someone, advising, preaching to them, and interrogating them. These roadblocks can really set you back in your communication, and it makes folks feel a little bit uncomfortable. So make sure to check yourself if you notice you're doing some of these. And then one of my last points is to really start to become comfortable with silence. When we get nervous, we talk. We try to fill the silence, but make sure to practice, taking that deep breath, maybe doing a box breath. It's very calming. It's pacing to the conversation. It helps you practice that patience and allows you and your partner that you're talking to time to process, explore the thoughts and feelings that were shared, and it creates that really great opportunity for reflection. So just make sure to use silence as a nice tool. And then for those of you that regularly consult, whether it's with family, employees, or with the farms that you work with, if you're one of the consultants, advice, it really equals pressure and stress. So really, if you're wanting to give advice, my suggestion would be to ask permission. May I offer you this piece of advice? To give a couple of options, and then to ask for those thoughts on the advice that you gave them. And that really decreases the pressure, and it helps allow a person to feel more in control. So to say that a person feels listened to means a lot more than just their ideas get heard. It's a sign of respect, and it makes people feel valued. And with that, I am just about out of time. So I appreciate everyone listening in today. And Ashley, I'll turn it back over to you.
Alrighty, thank you, Steph, for speaking on that and the power of listening today. So this wraps up our webinar and our speakers. I do have one more question to get to before I wrap up with asking you to fill out the evaluation and check out our resource pages. And this question goes back to both Dr. Wallace or Dr. Cabrera, whichever one would like to answer. And the question is, compared to confined TMR approach, grazing milk cows reduces milk yield about 40% on a per cow basis and improves the environmental footprint of dairy. What are the impediments to encouraging and incentivizing a transition to dairy as a means of supply management?
I can start.
Was it a transition to grazing?
I think that's what they got, transitioning to grazing.
Yeah, Victor, you got some econ on those?
I can make a few comments, I guess. I mean, it is an idea. I think it has some merit, and for those who were, I would say, in the borderline to decide on transitioning, this could be a good time for doing that. My experience and my understanding is, I mean, it is a big change. So I don't think you can support the same load of animals and requirements in pasture uh, compared to TMR. For sure, you will decrease the production, but if this is not done, I will caution, if this is not done in a plan and very systematic way, it could hurt in the long term. It would be similar to the point that Dick made in his presentation. The fact it is similar to decrease very strongly the diet on the cows. It is not that much different on that. And so if you really are thinking on moving that direction anyway, this is a good time to do it. I would not disagree with that. But if you are planning after situation changes to go back after doing a strong grazing pasture management, I think that maybe that would be a very difficult transition to come back.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Victor, is that it is certainly if the transition to grazing is something that you are planning, it's a longer term. I mean, setting up pastures, paddocks. I've actually worked with a lot of grazing herds, and it's one way to produce milk a lot less cost. But then with that reduced cost, obviously comes a reduced volume and reduced revenue. So you got to weigh it all together. But if you have adequate resources from a land base to convert to grazing, it certainly is a possibility. Obviously, not going to be able to do that with 2,000 cows, at least not in Wisconsin here. But certainly other operations, you certainly could find ways to make that happen and start that transition accordingly.
All righty, thank you. Well, that looks like all that we have for questions. So on behalf of UW-Madison Division of Extension, again, I'd like to thank our speakers today as well as all of our participants. You will be receiving a follow-up email with additional resources for you on today's presentation. So please check out our Division of Extension Dairy website page and also our Division of Extension COVID-19 website page to view the fact sheets that we talked about in this webinar today and also obtain more resources related to dairy and our current pandemic. Today, please take a few minutes to also fill out the evaluation that will be linked in the email. I do want to make one more reminder that Division of Extension is also hosting a webinar tomorrow starting at 1 p.m. As part of the Farm Management Through a Crisis series. And the topic will be financial support programs going through the PPP, EIDL, and the PUA. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.